There's a moment when your own child looks at you like you're a stranger, like you're something dirty that wandered in off the street. When the person you gave your whole life to stands in front of their new world and chooses to pretend you don't exist. That moment changes everything. It burns through every memory, every sacrifice, every late night you worked to give them something better. My daughter Jessica learned that shame is a double-edged sword, and sometimes the person you're trying to hide ends up being the one holding all the cards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda Martinez, and at 52, I thought I understood what motherhood meant. 28 years of dental hygienist work, 28 years of putting someone else's dreams before my own, 28 years of believing that love and sacrifice would be enough. I've spent my entire adult life in Phoenix, Arizona, working at Dr. Webb's dental practice on Central Avenue, the same practice where I started fresh out of community college with a toddler on my hip and determination in my heart. When people ask me about my life, I tell them about the small ranch house in Tempe where I raised my 2 daughters. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that's seen more tears than most therapists' offices. The mortgage is almost paid off. Now, a fact that still amazes me some mornings when I wake up and remember I actually made it through the hardest years. The house isn't much to look at from the outside. Beige stucco with desert landscaping that requires more hope than water. But every square foot represents something I earned. My younger daughter Sophie is 24 and finishing her master's degree in social work at Arizona State. She calls me every Sunday without fail, tells me about her classes, and her boyfriend Marcus, who makes her laugh until she snorts. Sophie remembers where she came from, remembers the sacrifices we made together as a family. She's the daughter who still asks for my recipes and sends me photos of her attempts to recreate my enchiladas in her tiny apartment kitchen. Then there's Jessica. Jessica Martinez, 28 years old, marketing coordinator at Syntech Solutions, one of those tech companies that sprouted up in Phoenix like desert flowers after a rare rain. She lives in a luxury high-rise in Scottsdale, drives a lease BMW, and carries handbags that cost more than my monthly car payment. Jessica was always the ambitious one, the dreamer who talked about big houses and important jobs from the time she could string sentences together. When Jessica was 7, she announced at our dinner table that she was going to be rich someday, not just comfortable, but actually wealthy. I remember laughing, not at her dream, but at the absolute certainty in her voice, the way she said it, like she was stating a simple fact about the weather. From that moment forward, everything she did was calculated to reach that goal. Honor roll, student council, debate team, whatever it took to build the perfect college application. I supported that dream in every way my paycheck would allow. When Jessica expressed interest in private school because the public school in our neighborhood wasn't challenging enough, I picked up weekend shifts at the urgent care dental clinic across town. 12-hour Saturday shifts cleaning teeth for people who couldn't afford regular care. Also, Jessica could attend Desert Vista Preparatory Academy with the doctors' and lawyers' kids. The tuition at Desert Vista was crushing for a single mother on a dental hygienist's salary, but Jessica had worked so hard to get accepted. She'd tested into their academic excellence program, earned a partial scholarship that covered about 60% of the costs. I just had to figure out how to cover the rest, plus uniforms, textbooks, field trips, and all the extras that came with running in those circles. I sold my wedding ring first, the one David had given me before he decided that marriage and fatherhood weren't the adventure he'd signed up for. Then my grandmother's jewelry, piece by piece, until my jewelry box held nothing but the simple silver cross necklace Sophie had given me for Christmas when she was 12. I moved out of my own apartment and into a shared rental with 2 other women, sending Jessica the money I saved on rent so she could participate in the school's European art history trip. For 6 years, I worked 60-hour weeks and lived like a college student, so Jessica could have opportunities I'd never dreamed of. No vacations, no new clothes unless they came from thrift stores, No dinners out except for Jessica's birthday and Christmas. I drove a 1998 Honda Civic with manual windows and a radio that only picked up AM stations, but Jessica had everything she needed to succeed. During those high school years, Jessica started changing in ways I told myself were natural. She became more conscious of brands, more aware of who had what and where it came from. Our conversations grew shorter, focused mainly on her academic achievements and college preparation. She started spending more time at friends' houses in North Scottsdale with pools and guest rooms and parents who drove matching luxury SUVs. When she got accepted to the University of Arizona's business school, I felt a pride so fierce it temporarily overshadowed the financial panic that came with it. Jessica hugged me that day, tears in her eyes, and said she couldn't have done it without me. She promised that all my sacrifices would be worth it, that someday she'd take care of me the way I'd taken care of her. College meant another 4 years of financial strain, but Jessica was building her future. I took on additional shifts at the urgent care clinic, learned to stretch groceries further than should have been physically possible, and convinced myself that the growing distance between us was just the natural process of a young woman becoming independent. The day Jessica graduated with her business degree, I sat in the audience wearing a dress I'd bought for $5 at Goodwill, carefully altered to fit properly. I watched her cross that stage in her cap and gown, beautiful and confident, and ready to conquer the world I'd helped her reach. She found me afterward in the crowd of families, gave me a quick hug, and introduced me to her roommates as my mom, who helped make this possible. That summer, Jessica moved back to Phoenix, but not to Tempe. She'd landed an entry-level position at Syntech Solutions and found an apartment in downtown Scottsdale, a sleek one-bedroom with floor-to-ceiling windows and amenities I couldn't pronounce. I visited once, bringing homemade tamales and a small housewarming gift, a framed photo of the two of us from her graduation day. The apartment was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, all clean lines and neutral colors and furniture that looked like it had never been actually used for living. Jessica took the tamales but left the photo on the counter, and I noticed she didn't include it in the careful arrangement of decorative objects when I saw her post photos of her new place on social media. We had lunch on her balcony that day, eating my tamales while she told me about her job, her coworkers, her plans for advancement within the company. I listened and asked questions and tried to connect with this polished version of my daughter. When I mentioned that my own work had been particularly challenging lately, with Dr. Webb considering retirement and the uncertainty that might bring, Jessica changed the subject to her new gym membership and the Pilates classes she'd started taking. That fall, I got the news that would change everything. Dr. Webb announced his retirement, and the practice was being sold to a larger dental group. The new owners would be keeping some staff but eliminating positions they considered redundant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After 25 years of building relationships with patients and maintaining perfect attendance, I was handed a severance package and a polite explanation about restructuring for efficiency. The package was fair, 3-month salary and extended benefits. But it wasn't enough. Not with a mortgage that still had 6 years left. Not with the rising cost of everything from groceries to utilities. Not at my age in a job market that valued youth and the latest technology over experience and dedication. I applied everywhere: dental practices, medical offices, urgent care clinics. I had excellent references and a spotless work history, but every interview seemed to end the same way. They'd chosen someone whose qualifications better aligned with their current needs, which was a polite way of saying they'd hired someone younger and cheaper. By February, I was dipping into the small retirement account I'd managed to build over the years. By April, that was gone too. The mortgage company sent their first warning notice on a Tuesday morning, official letterhead, and 30 days to bring the account current. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Jessica had done her homework and Sophie still did when she visited, staring at numbers that didn't add up no matter how I arranged them. I thought about calling Sophie, but she was already working, part-time to pay for graduate school and living on ramen noodles and determination. I couldn't add my problems to her plate. So I called Jessica instead. She answered on the third ring, her voice professional and slightly distracted. Linda Martinez speaking. She'd started answering her phone with her full name after getting the Syntech job, a habit that felt like another small wall between us. Jessica, it's Mom, I said, hating how my voice already sounded smaller than I intended. Oh, hi, Mom. I'm actually in the middle of something. Can I call you back later? It's important, I said, the words sticking in my throat like broken glass. I need to talk to you about something. A pause, and I could hear the sound of typing in the background. What's going on? I explained about Dr. Webb's retirement, the job loss, the failed interviews. My voice stayed steady until I mentioned the mortgage notice, and then it cracked just slightly. I just need some help getting back on my feet, I finished. Maybe a small loan to cover the mortgage for a couple of months while I find something new. Another pause, longer this time. Mom, that's really tough, but I'm just getting established myself. I have student loans, rent, car payments. I can't just write you a check for thousands of dollars. I'm not asking for thousands, I said quickly. Just enough to buy me some time. I'll pay you back as soon as I'm working again. I really can't afford it right now, she said, and I could hear her getting ready to end the conversation. Maybe you should look into downsizing. There are some nice senior apartment complexes that might be more manageable for someone your age. Someone my age. As if 52 was ancient. As if I was already 1 foot in the grave instead of a woman who'd worked her entire adult life and hit a temporary rough patch. I can't qualify for a new lease without steady income, I admitted, the words tasting bitter. And my credit has taken a hit from the missed payments. Silence stretched between us, filled with everything she wasn't saying. Finally, she cleared her throat. Maybe you could stay with Sophie for a while, just until you get back on your feet? Sophie, who was living in a studio apartment barely big enough for one person, surviving on student loans and part-time work. Jessica knew exactly what she was suggesting and exactly why it was impossible. What about staying with you? I asked, the words coming out smaller than I'd intended. Just temporarily, a few weeks at most. I could help with cooking, cleaning, whatever you need. The silence that followed felt like falling into a deep well. When Jessica finally spoke, her voice was different, harder. Mom, that's not going to work. Why not? I asked, though part of me already knew. Look, I'm trying to build something here, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I'm up for a promotion at work. I'm dating someone serious. I have a reputation to maintain. I can't have you staying here. I don't understand, I said, though I was beginning to. My colleagues, my boyfriend, his family, they have certain expectations, she continued, each word landing like a physical blow. You're a dental hygienist, Mom. You drive an old Honda and shop at thrift stores. That's not the image I've worked so hard to create. There it was, laid bare. Not the daughter I'd raised, not the woman I'd sacrificed everything to help succeed, but someone who saw me as an embarrassment, a threat to the life she'd built on the foundation of my sacrifices. I see, I said, my voice hollow. I wouldn't want to damage your image. Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be, she said, sounding genuinely frustrated rather than apologetic. I've worked really hard to get where I am. I can't risk it. I hung up before she could say anything else, before she could offer some meaningless gesture that would salve her conscience without actually helping. I sat at that kitchen table until the sun went down, staring at the mortgage, notice, and the framed photos of my daughters that lined the windowsill above the sink. That night, something shifted inside me. A fundamental change in how I saw myself and my relationship with the daughter I'd devoted my life to supporting. I'd raised Jessica to be strong and independent, but I'd apparently also raised her to be someone who would abandon the person who'd given her everything when that person became inconvenient. As I packed up my life into boxes over the following weeks, I made myself a promise. Jessica wanted to pretend I didn't exist, wanted to erase the history of where she came from and who had helped her get there. But some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and some debts come due whether you acknowledge them or not. The day I moved out of my house, the house where I'd raised both my daughters and built a life from nothing, I didn't cry. I watched. The bank representative change the locks and hand me the final paperwork with the same professional courtesy Jessica had used to dismiss my plea for help. 28 years of mortgage payments, 28 years of memories, locked behind a door I could no longer open. I loaded my remaining possessions into a rented storage unit and moved into a small apartment complex in central Phoenix, the kind of place where people minded their own business and nobody asked too many questions about why you'd landed there. The apartment was clean but basic, and the rent was something I could manage with unemployment benefits and the part-time work I'd started picking up at catering companies. It was during one of those catering gigs that I first worked at the Scottsdale Country Club, serving cocktails to the kind of people Jessica was so desperate to impress. The club was everything I'd expected: understated luxury and old money confidence, the kind of place where the waitstaff was invisible until you needed something and then expected to disappear again immediately. I was good at being invisible. 28 years of working in other people's mouths had taught me how to be present but unnoticed, professional but unremarkable. The catering manager liked my work ethic and started calling me regularly for events. The pay was decent, and the work kept me busy enough that I didn't spend all my time thinking about how completely my life had changed. It was at the country club that I learned about Jessica's engagement. Not from Jessica herself, of course, but from the society page announcement I glimpsed while clearing glasses from a table where some women were gossiping about the upcoming wedding. Jessica Martinez, marketing coordinator at Syntex Solutions, engaged to Bradford Wellington III, son of the prominent Wellington family who owned half the luxury car dealerships in the Phoenix metro area. The announcement mentioned an engagement party to be held at the Scottsdale Country Club in 6 weeks, a celebration for 150 of their closest friends and family. I stood there holding a tray of empty champagne glasses, reading about my daughter's engagement in a newspaper someone had left behind, learning that she was marrying into one of the wealthiest families in Arizona from a stranger's discarded reading material. That night I called Sophie. "Did you know Jessica was engaged?" I asked without preamble. "Yeah," Sophie said quietly. "She told me a few weeks ago. She said she'd tell you when the time was right." "When the time was right," I repeated. "Her engagement party is in 6 weeks, Sophie. At the country club where I serve drinks to people who don't even see me." Sophie was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, maybe you should talk to her. Maybe she's just scared about how complicated things have gotten." "There's nothing complicated about it," I said. "She's ashamed of me, and she's decided the easiest solution is to pretend I don't exist." "That's not true," Sophie protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "When was the last time she invited me to anything? When was the last time she mentioned me to any of her friends? When was the last time she acted like I was her mother instead of some embarrassing mistake from her past?" Sophie didn't have an answer, because there wasn't one. Jessica had been systematically erasing me from her life for years, and her engagement was just the final step in that process. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the catering company. They needed additional staff for a large engagement party at the country club. Would I be available to work the event on Saturday evening? I said yes, knowing exactly whose engagement party it would be. Some opportunities are too perfect to be coincidental, and sometimes the universe provides exactly the stage you need for the performance that's been building for months. The night of the engagement party, I dressed in the standard catering uniform. Black slacks and white shirt, hair pulled back professionally. Minimal makeup, just another invisible service worker in a room full of people who mattered. I'd worked enough events at the club to know how to blend into the background while staying alert to everything happening around me. The party was everything I'd expected, elegant and expensive and designed to impress. Jessica looked stunning in a designer dress that probably cost more than I'd ever spent on clothing in a single year. Bradford was handsome in the way that money makes men handsome, well-groomed and confident, and completely at ease in his expensive suit. I stayed in the background during cocktail hour, serving champagne and canapes to guests who didn't so much as make eye contact with the staff. Jessica worked the room like the professional she'd become, charming Bradford's parents and networking with people who could advance her career or social standing. It wasn't until the dinner portion of the evening that I saw my opening. Jessica was seated at the head table with Bradford and both sets of parents, preparing to give a speech about family and gratitude and the importance of the people who'd shaped her into the woman she'd become. As she stood up to address the room, I moved closer to the head table area, positioning myself where I could be seen but not obviously intrusive. Just another member of the catering staff, ready to clear plates or refill water glasses as needed. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Jessica began, her voice clear and confident. "Bradford and I are so grateful to be surrounded by the people who matter most to us, the people who've supported us and believed in us and helped us become the people we are today." She paused, scanning the room with practiced grace. "I especially want to thank my family for everything they've given me. My father, David, who taught me the importance of ambition and never settling for less than I deserve. David, who'd walked out when Jessica was 3 and Sophie was still in diapers. David, who'd sent exactly 12 child support payments in 28 years and showed up to graduation photos like he'd been there all along. My sister Sophie, who reminds me every day what it means to stay true to your values and help others. Sophie, who was notably absent from the engagement party because Jessica had told her the guest list was limited to immediate family and close friends. And most importantly, my mother Linda, who sacrificed so much to give me opportunities and taught me that hard work and determination can overcome any obstacle." The words hung in the air like smoke, beautiful and empty and completely disconnected from reality. Jessica was telling a room full of strangers about a mother who didn't exist, a saint who'd given everything and then gracefully stepped aside when her daughter outgrew her. I stepped forward, moving from the shadows along the wall toward the head table. A few people noticed, probably wondering why catering staff was moving around during the speech, but most attention remained focused on Jessica. "My mother couldn't be here tonight," Jessica continued. "But I know she's thinking of me and Bradford, and she's so proud of how far we've come together." I stopped directly beside the head table, close enough that Jessica couldn't miss me. If she glanced down, close enough that her future in-laws could see my face clearly. "Mom always told me that family is everything," Jessica said, her voice growing more emotional. "That the people who love you will always be there when you need them most, no matter what." That's when I cleared my throat, just loudly enough to be heard by the head table but not loud enough to disrupt the room. Jessica's eyes flicked downward, and I watched the color drain from her face as recognition hit her like a physical blow. For a moment, she froze completely, her prepared words dying in her throat as she stared at me in my catering uniform, standing 3 feet away from the table where she was spinning fairy tales about our relationship. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice barely audible but picked up by the microphone she was still holding. I smiled, the same warm smile I'd given her every day of her life until she'd decided I was too embarrassing to acknowledge. "Hello, Jessica," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. What a beautiful speech about family loyalty. The room began to stir as people realized something unexpected was happening. Bradford looked confused. His parents were exchanging glances, and Jessica stood frozen with the microphone in her hand and nowhere to hide. "I'm so glad I could be here to see you celebrate with all these important people," I continued, my voice warm and conversational. "Especially after you told me I couldn't stay with you for a few weeks because I might damage your reputation. It's wonderful to hear how much family means to you." Jessica's face went from pale to red as the implications of my words sank in. Around the room, conversations had stopped as people strained to hear what was happening at the head table. "This is Linda Martinez," I said, addressing the room directly now. "Jessica's mother. The dental hygienist who worked 60-hour weeks and sold her wedding ring so Jessica could attend private school. The woman who's currently homeless because she lost her job and couldn't get help from the daughter she spent 28 years supporting." The silence in the room was complete now, hundreds of eyes moving between Jessica and me as the carefully constructed image she'd built began to crumble in real time. "But don't worry," I added, my voice still perfectly pleasant. "I understand why she couldn't acknowledge me. After all, I'm just the woman who gave her everything so she could stand here tonight and pretend I don't exist." I turned and walked away, leaving Jessica standing at the microphone with her mouth open and her fairy tale in ruins around her feet. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of voices rising, questions being asked, explanations being demanded. I collected my things from the staff area and left through the service entrance, walking out into the desert night with my shoulders straight and my conscience clear. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again, not the invisible woman my daughter had tried to erase, but Linda Martinez, who'd raised 2 daughters and deserved better than being treated like a shameful secret. The next morning, I woke up in my small apartment and made coffee with a sense of peace I hadn't felt since that first mortgage notice had arrived. My phone had been buzzing with missed calls and text messages since the night before, but I wasn't ready to deal with Jessica's attempts at damage control just yet. Sophie called around noon, her voice a mixture of shock and admiration. "Mom, what did you do?" "I told the truth," I said simply. "Sometimes that's the most powerful thing you can do." 3 days later, the catering company called to let me know I wouldn't be needed for future events at the country club. Jessica's influence, no doubt, making sure I couldn't cause any more embarrassment. It didn't matter. Word had gotten around. The catering community about what had happened, and offers for work started coming from other companies who appreciated someone with backbone. A week after that, Dr. Patricia Hernandez called me directly. She'd been at the engagement party, had witnessed the whole thing, and wanted to offer me a position as office manager at her dental practice. "I value loyalty and honesty," she said, "and it sounds like you have both in abundance." Jessica's engagement party became the story that people told at dinner parties for months afterward, the night when a mother's love turned into a mother's reckoning. Some people thought I was vindictive. Others thought I was brave. I thought I was finally, after 52 years, standing up for myself. The wedding itself was much smaller than originally planned, a quiet ceremony with immediate family only. I wasn't invited, of course, but Sophie was, and she told me later that Jessica had seemed nervous the entire time, as if she was waiting for another shoe to drop. I never got an apology, never got an acknowledgement that what Jessica had done was wrong, but I did get something better. I got my self-respect back, and I got the satisfaction of knowing that every time Jessica tells someone about family values or maternal love, she'll remember the night her mother stood up and told the truth about what those words really mean. Some people say I went too far. That family should forgive family no matter what. But I learned something important that night at the country club. You can't love someone into loving you back, and you can't sacrifice your way into someone's respect. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give your child is the lesson that actions have consequences, even when those actions are taken against the person who loved them first and most completely. I sleep peacefully now, in my small apartment with my modest furniture and my hard-earned dignity. Jessica wanted a mother she could be proud of in public while treating her like an embarrassment in private. Instead, she learned that the woman who raised her had more strength than she'd ever imagined, and sometimes that strength means knowing when to stop being invisible and start being seen. Jessica's apartment warming party was my first real glimpse into the world she was building without me. She'd invited me, reluctantly I suspected, because Sophie had insisted that family should be included in important moments. The invitation came via text message 3 days before the event, casual and brief, as if she was inviting me to pick up dry cleaning rather than see her new life. I drove my Honda Civic through the winding streets of Scottsdale, past million-dollar homes with perfectly manicured lawns and circular driveways filled with luxury cars. Jessica's apartment complex rose from the desert like a glass and steel monument to success, all sharp angles and reflective surfaces that caught the Arizona sun and threw it back in dazzling sheets of light. The parking garage was full of BMWs, and Mercedes, Audis, and Teslas, cars that cost more than I'd made in some entire years. The elevator to Jessica's floor was mirrored and silent, carrying me up to the 15th floor where my daughter had carved out her space in the sky. When the doors opened, I could hear music and laughter echoing down the hallway, the sounds of a party in full swing. Jessica's door was propped open, and I could see into her apartment where young professionals mingled with wine glasses and conversations about quarterly projections and weekend trips to Sedona. Jessica appeared in the doorway as I approached, and for just a moment, her face showed something I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or concern as she took in my appearance. I'd worn my best dress, a navy blue sheath I'd bought for a dental conference 5 years earlier, paired with nude pumps that were comfortable but clearly not designer. My hair was styled as well as I could manage at home, and I carried a small gift bag containing a set of kitchen towels I'd embroidered with her initials. "Mom, you made it," she said, stepping forward to give me a quick hug that felt more like a social gesture than genuine affection. "Come in, let me introduce you to everyone." The apartment was even more impressive than I'd remembered from my solo visit months earlier. The main living area flowed seamlessly from kitchen to dining to living room, all decorated in shades of white and gray that spoke of expensive taste and professional design. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the Scottsdale skyline, city lights beginning to twinkle as the sun set behind the mountains. Jessica guided me through the crowd, introducing me to her co-workers and friends with the same tone she might use to present a mildly interesting piece of furniture. "This is my mom, Linda," she'd say, and then quickly pivot to talking about someone's recent promotion or upcoming vacation plans. I smiled and nodded, and tried to find my place in conversations about investment portfolios and wine country tours, topics that might as well have been conducted in a foreign language. It was when Bradford arrived that I began to understand the real purpose of my invitation. He swept into the apartment like he owned it, all confident smiles and firm handshakes, followed by a couple who could only be his parents. Patricia Wellington was everything I'd expected from Jessica's descriptions: perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that whispered expense rather than shouting it. Her husband Richard carried himself with the casual authority of someone who'd never had to worry about money a day in his life. Jessica's entire demeanor changed when Bradford walked in. She became more animated, more polished, her laugh a little louder, and her gestures more refined. She practically glowed as she introduced him around the room, and when his parents arrived, she transformed into someone I barely recognized, speaking in measured tones about her work at Syntec and her plans for career advancement. "And this must be Linda," Patricia said when Jessica finally brought the Wellingtons over to meet me. Her smile was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to appear gracious, but distant enough to maintain appropriate social boundaries. "Jessica has told us so much about you." I wondered what exactly Jessica had told them, because the stories certainly hadn't included my current unemployment, or the fact that I was living month to month in a studio apartment across town. "It's wonderful to meet you," I replied, extending my hand for what turned out to be one of those brief, fingertip handshakes that wealthy women seem to have perfected. "You must be so proud of Jessica," Richard added, his voice carrying the particular tone that successful men used when speaking to people they considered beneath their notice. She certainly made quite an impression at the club. Very bright, very ambitious. The club. Already Jessica was part of their world, attending events and making impressions at places I'd probably never see except from the service entrance. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized how completely she'd integrated herself into their social circle, how seamlessly she'd erased any evidence of where she'd actually come from. "Yes, I'm very proud," I managed, watching Jessica beam under their approval like a plant turning toward the sun. The conversation moved on to safer topics, vacation destinations, and restaurant recommendations. The kind of small talk that filled the spaces between meaningful connections. I found myself standing slightly outside the circle, present but not really included, watching Jessica navigate these relationships with skills I'd never taught her because I'd never possessed them myself. As the evening progressed, I noticed how Jessica positioned herself throughout the apartment. She was always where the Wellingtons could see her, always engaged with the most important people in the room, always performing the role of successful young professional with impeccable taste and bright prospects. When someone mentioned that the apartment's kitchen renovation must have cost a fortune, Jessica laughed and said she'd been saving for years to create exactly the space she wanted. Saving for years, as if her college education had been paid for with air and good intentions. As if the private school tuition and study abroad programs and professional wardrobe had materialized through her own financial wizardry rather than my 60-hour work weeks and thrift store dinners. I found myself gravitating toward the kitchen, where the catering staff was discreetly managing the flow of appetizers and drinks. These were people who looked like me, who understood what it meant to work for everything you had and to serve others who took that service for granted. I helped myself to a glass of wine from the kitchen counter, rather than waiting for one of the servers to bring me one, a small gesture that probably went unnoticed by everyone except Jessica. "Mom, what are you doing?" she asked, appearing beside me with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The servers will bring you whatever you need." "I'm perfectly capable of pouring my own wine," I said mildly, but I could see the tension in her shoulders as she glanced back toward where Bradford and his parents were engaged in conversation with several of her coworkers. "I know that," she said quickly. "I just want you to be comfortable." But comfort wasn't really the issue, and we both knew it. The issue was that I looked like someone who belonged in the kitchen rather than the living room. Someone who poured her own wine because she was used to taking care of herself rather than being taken care of. I was a reminder of the life Jessica had worked so hard to leave behind, evidence that her polish and sophistication were acquired rather than inherited. The moment that crystallized everything came later in the evening, when Patricia Wellington cornered Jessica near the windows with what appeared to be an important conversation. I was close enough to overhear, refilling my wine glass at the kitchen island, while trying to look like I was studying the city view rather than eavesdropping. "Bradford is quite taken with you," Patricia was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to arranging other people's lives. "Richard and I think you'd be a wonderful addition to our family, but of course these things require careful consideration." Jessica nodded seriously, hanging on every word like her future depended on Patricia's approval, which it probably did. "Tell me about your family background," Patricia continued. "Bradford mentioned that your father is in business?" I held my breath, waiting to hear how Jessica would navigate this particular minefield. David Martinez was currently managing a tire shop in Tucson and sending child support payments only when threatened with legal action. Hardly the business background Patricia was imagining. "Dad's always been entrepreneurial," Jessica said carefully, which was technically true if you counted his various failed ventures and persistent inability to hold steady employment. "He taught me the importance of independence and taking calculated risks." "And your mother?" Patricia asked. "Bradford said she works in healthcare?" Jessica's pause was so brief that anyone who didn't know her as well as I did might have missed it. "Mom's in dental practice management," she said smoothly, elevating my job title in a way that sounded impressive while being vague enough to avoid specific questions about education or credentials. Dental practice management. As if I supervised teams and made executive decisions rather than cleaning teeth and filing insurance claims. The lie was small but significant, a careful reshaping of reality that made me sound like someone who belonged in Patricia's world rather than someone who served it. "How lovely," Patricia said approvingly. "Healthcare administration is such important work. I'm sure she's been a wonderful role model for your own professional development." I watched Jessica smile and nod, accepting praise for a fictional version of me that bore little resemblance to the woman who'd actually raised her. The woman who'd taught her to stretch hamburger meat with breadcrumbs and to check library books out again and again instead of buying them new. The woman who'd worked through Christmas vacation because holiday pay meant Jessica could have the calculator she needed for advanced math class. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself helping clear glasses and plates without really thinking about it. Muscle memory from years of cleaning up after events at work and home. Jessica appeared beside me again, this time with genuine distress in her voice. "Mom, please stop," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "The catering staff will handle the cleanup." "I'm just helping," I said, but I could see in her face that my help was the last thing she wanted. "I know, but Bradford's parents are still here, and I need you to just let them do their job." Let them do their job, as if helping clean up was somehow beneath me, as if I should be too important or too delicate to stack plates and rinse wine glasses. The irony was stunning, considering that I'd spent the last 28 years doing exactly those kinds of tasks to support her ambitions. I set down the plates I'd been gathering and looked at my daughter, really looked at her, seeing clearly for the first time how much effort she was putting into being someone she wasn't. The Jessica I'd raised would never have hired catering, staff for an apartment party. She would have made sandwiches and bought chips, and been grateful for anyone who showed up to celebrate with her. "Of course," I said finally, "I wouldn't want to interfere with your image." The word hung between us like a challenge, and I saw Jessica's face flush slightly as she realized I understood exactly what was happening. She wasn't ashamed of what I did for work. She was ashamed of what my presence revealed about her own background, her own history, her own carefully constructed persona. I said my goodbyes to the remaining guests, thanked Jessica for including me, and made my way back to the parking garage where my Honda sat surrounded by luxury vehicles like a sparrow among peacocks. As I drove home through the expensive neighborhoods of Scottsdale, past the country clubs and gated communities that Jessica was so eager to join, I felt something shifting inside me. The drive back to my modest apartment in Central Phoenix took me through parts of the city where people lived paycheck to paycheck, where families made tough choices about groceries and utilities, where mothers worked multiple jobs to give their children opportunities they'd never had themselves. This was the world I knew, the world that had shaped both Jessica and me, the world she was now pretending had never existed. Over the following months, the pattern became more pronounced. Jessica's calls grew shorter and less frequent, focused mainly on her professional achievements and social calendar. When she did mention Bradford, it was always in the context of events and activities that required money and connections I didn't have. Gallery openings and charity fundraisers, weekend trips to California and ski vacations in Colorado, a lifestyle that was light years away from anything I could participate in or even understand. She never directly told me not to contact her, but the message was clear in the delayed responses to my texts and the way conversations felt rushed and obligatory. When I called to tell her about getting a part-time job at a dental office across town, she congratulated me with the same tone she might use to acknowledge a stranger's minor accomplishment. The distance wasn't just geographical anymore. though the 30-minute drive between our neighborhoods might as well have been the Grand Canyon for all the connection we maintained. It was psychological, emotional, a deliberate severing of ties that had taken years to develop and seconds to cut. Sophie noticed the change too, though she was diplomatic in how she addressed it. During one of our Sunday phone calls, she mentioned seeing Jessica's social media posts from another elegant dinner party, another networking event, another step up the social ladder. "She looks happy," Sophie said carefully, but I could hear the concern in her voice. "She looks successful," I corrected. "That's not always the same thing." "Have you talked to her lately?" "We text occasionally," I said, which was true if you counted brief exchanges about weather and work as meaningful communication. "She's busy building her career." Sophie was quiet for a moment, and I knew she was choosing her words carefully. "Mom, do you think she's changing?" Changing. Such a gentle word for what felt like a complete personality transplant, a systematic erasure of everything that had once made Jessica who she was. The daughter I'd raised had been ambitious, yes, but also compassionate, driven, but also grateful. Success-oriented, but still connected to her roots and the people who'd helped her achieve her goals. "People change when they think they need to," I said finally. "Sometimes they change into better versions of themselves, and sometimes they change into strangers." The conversation stayed with me for days afterward, forcing me to confront the possibility that the Jessica I'd known and loved might be gone forever, replaced by someone who valued image over authenticity and social status over family loyalty. It was a painful realization, like mourning someone who was still alive but no longer recognizable. The breaking point was still months away, but I could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon. Jessica was building a life that had no room for me in it, constructing an identity that required my absence rather than my presence. Every success she achieved seemed to create more distance between us. Every step up the social ladder took her further away from the woman who'd made those steps possible. I began to understand that Jessica's transformation wasn't accidental or temporary. It was deliberate and comprehensive, a conscious decision to become someone else entirely. The question was whether she would be able to maintain that transformation when reality inevitably intruded, when the foundation of lies and omissions she'd built her new life on began to crack under pressure. The woman who'd raised her had taught her many things about perseverance and determination, about working for what you wanted and never giving up on your dreams. But apparently, I'd failed to teach her the most important lesson of all, that you can't build lasting happiness on a foundation of shame about where you came from and the people who loved you enough to sacrifice everything for your success. The invitation to Jessica's 28th birthday party arrived on expensive cardstock, cream-colored with gold-embossed lettering that announced the celebration would be held at her apartment's rooftop terrace. The formality of it struck me as odd, considering it was addressed to her own mother, but everything about Jessica's life had become formal and distant over the past year. I spent more time than I should have deciding what to wear, standing in front of my small closet in the studio apartment that had become home after losing my house. The clothes hanging there told the story of my economic decline. Professional blouses that had seen better days mixed with discount store finds and hand-me-downs from church donation drives. Finally, I settled on a black dress I'd worn to Dr. Webb's retirement party, paired with the pearls my mother had given me for my wedding, the one piece of jewelry I'd refused to sell even during the worst financial crisis. The drive to Scottsdale felt longer than usual, maybe because I was dreading what I'd find when I arrived. Jessica's recent social media posts had shown a lifestyle that seemed to require constant documentation, every meal at trendy restaurants, every weekend getaway to luxury resorts, every social gathering filled with people who looked like they'd stepped out of magazine advertisements for expensive watches and designer handbags. The rooftop terrace was transformed for the occasion, strung with lights that sparkled against the desert sky, and decorated with floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly rent. A professional bartender had been hired to serve signature cocktails, and catering staff circulated with appetizers that looked like tiny works of art. The guest list was exclusively Jessica's new world, co-workers from Syntech and friends from Bradford's social circle, people who spoke in the casual shorthand of shared privilege and mutual understanding. I recognized no one except Bradford and his parents, who held court near the bar with the confidence of people accustomed to being the most important figures in any room. Jessica moved between groups with practiced grace, playing the perfect hostess while wearing a dress that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothing in the past 2 years combined. When she spotted me near the elevator, her face showed a quick flash of something that might have been regret before settling into the bright smile she'd perfected for social occasions. She made her way over with the careful steps of someone navigating a social minefield, aware that every interaction was being observed and evaluated by people whose opinions mattered for her future. "Mom, you made it," she said, giving me the same type of brief hug she might offer an acquaintance she was obligated to acknowledge. "You look nice." The compliment felt automatic, polite but empty, the kind of thing you said when you couldn't think of anything genuine to offer. I thanked her and asked about the party, admiring the decorations while trying to find something meaningful to say that wouldn't require her to explain my presence to the other guests. Jessica introduced me to a few people as we moved through the crowd, always with the same careful phrasing that positioned me as someone peripheral to her real life. "This is my mom, Linda," she'd say, and then immediately pivot to discussing someone's recent vacation or promotion, effectively ending any opportunity for deeper conversation about our relationship or my role in her success. I found myself gravitating toward the edges of the party, standing near the terrace railing where I could observe without being expected to participate in conversations about investment strategies and second homes. The view from the rooftop was spectacular. The entire Phoenix metropolitan area spread out below us like a glittering circuit board, but I felt like I was viewing it all from behind glass, present but not truly part of the scene. It was during Jessica's birthday toast that the evening took its decisive turn. Bradford stood up with practiced confidence, calling for everyone's attention with the natural authority of someone who'd grown up expecting to be heard. The crowd gathered around as he raised his champagne glass, preparing to make the kind of speech that would later be remembered and repeated at dinner parties throughout their social circle. "I want to thank everyone for helping us celebrate Jessica's special day," he began, his voice carrying easily across the terrace. "As many of you know, Jessica and I have been together for almost a year now, and I've had the privilege of watching her become an integral part of our community. Here in Scottsdale, our community." The possessive pronoun wasn't accidental, and neither was the implication that Jessica's acceptance into their world was something that had been granted rather than earned through her own efforts and achievements. "Jessica represents everything we value," Bradford continued. "Ambition, intelligence, and the kind of class that can't be taught, only inherited. Class that can't be taught, only inherited." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as the implications of his words sank in. He was essentially saying that Jessica's worth came from qualities she'd been born with rather than qualities she'd developed through years of hard work and sacrifice, erasing not just my contribution to her success, but the entire struggle that had made that success possible. Jessica beamed under his praise, accepting the compliments with gracious nods and the kind of pleased expression that suggested she agreed completely with his assessment of her inherent superiority. There was no acknowledgement that her education had been paid for through someone else's sacrifice, no recognition that her opportunities had been purchased with another person's financial ruin. "So here's to Jessica," Bradford concluded, raising his glass higher, "who has everything it takes to be exactly where she belongs." The crowd raised their glasses in response, toasting Jessica's natural fitness for their world, while she basked in the approval of people who had no idea what it had actually cost to put her in a position to receive it. I raised my own glass, mechanically, going through the motions while feeling increasingly disconnected from the celebration happening around me. After the toast, Jessica was surrounded by well-wishers and admirers, people eager to bask in Bradford's reflected approval and to position themselves favorably within the social hierarchy his words had reinforced. I stood alone near the railing, holding my champagne and watching my daughter accept congratulations for achievements that were being attributed to her breeding rather than her effort. Patricia Wellington approached me during this lull, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who never did anything without a purpose. Her smile was perfectly calibrated to appear friendly while maintaining appropriate social distance, the kind of expression that wealthy women seem to learn in childhood, along with proper table manners and thank you note etiquette. "Linda, isn't this lovely?" she said, gesturing toward the party with one manicured hand while holding her champagne flute with the other. "Jessica has such exquisite taste in everything." I agreed that the party was beautiful, which was true even if the compliment felt like it was intended to highlight the contrast between Jessica's current lifestyle and whatever Patricia imagined my own circumstances to be. She seemed to be studying me carefully, taking in details about my appearance and demeanor that would later be discussed and analyzed with other members of their social circle. "You must be so proud of how well she's integrated into our community," Patricia continued, the words carrying multiple layers of meaning that I was clearly expected to decode and respond to appropriately. Integrated, as if Jessica had been a foreign element that required careful assimilation rather than a successful young woman who'd earned her place through her own talents and determination. The language was subtle, but unmistakable, positioning Jessica's acceptance as something that had been granted by their group rather than something she'd achieved independently. "Jessica has always been determined to succeed," I said carefully, trying to find words that acknowledged her achievements without accepting Patricia's framing of those achievements as dependent on their approval. "Oh yes, ambition is so important," Patricia agreed. "But it's breeding that really matters in the end. You can teach someone skills, but you can't teach them how to belong." Breeding. The word hung in the air between us like a challenge, carrying with it generations of assumptions about class and worthiness and the inherent superiority of people who'd never had to work for anything they possessed. I felt my jaw tighten as I realized that Patricia was essentially telling me that my daughter's value came from qualities that had nothing to do with me or the sacrifices I'd made to give her opportunities. "Jessica belongs wherever her talents and hard work take her," I replied, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Patricia's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes, a recognition that I wasn't going to play the role she'd expected me to play in this conversation. "Of course," she said smoothly, "though I think we can all agree that some people are simply born to excel in certain environments." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but the real communication had already taken place. Patricia had made it clear that Jessica's acceptance into their world was conditional and could be revoked if she failed to maintain the standards they'd established. More importantly, she'd made it clear that those standards had nothing to do with merit or achievement and everything to do with background and breeding, qualities that were supposedly inherent rather than developed. As the evening progressed, I began to notice how carefully Jessica managed her interactions with different groups of people. With Bradford's family and their friends, she adopted a slightly different accent, softer around the edges and more precise in its pronunciation. Her posture changed too, becoming more formal and controlled, as if she was constantly aware of being evaluated for her fitness to belong in their circle. When younger people from her office were around, she relaxed slightly, but still maintained a careful distance from anything that might reveal too much about her actual background. Conversations about childhood experiences were redirected toward more recent topics, and any mention of financial struggles or working-class experiences was quickly deflected with humor or subject changes. I found myself watching this performance with a mixture of fascination and horror, recognizing that Jessica had become extraordinarily skilled at code switching between different versions of herself, depending on her audience. The question was whether she remembered which version was actually real, or if the performance had become so complete that she'd lost track of the person she'd been before she'd learned to mimic the mannerisms and attitudes of people born to privilege. The breaking point came near the end of the evening, when most of the guests had left, and only Bradford's family and a few close friends remained. I was helping to clear glasses from tables, partly out of habit, and partly because I needed something to do with my hands while I processed everything I'd observed throughout the night. Jessica appeared beside me with a look of genuine panic in her eyes, glancing around to make sure no one was watching before speaking in a low, urgent voice. "Mom, what are you doing?" she asked, reaching out to take the glasses from my hands. "I'm helping clean up," I said, confused by her reaction to something that seemed perfectly natural to me. "Please don't," she said, her voice tight with stress. "The catering staff will handle everything. You're a guest here." But even as she said it, I could see in her face that I wasn't really a guest in any meaningful sense. I was an obligation, a duty, someone she felt compelled to invite, but hoped would remain invisible throughout the evening. The realization hit me like a physical blow, forcing me to confront the possibility that my presence at her birthday party wasn't a gesture of inclusion, but a necessity she was trying to manage as carefully as possible. "I see," I said quietly, setting down the glasses and stepping back from the table. "It's not that," Jessica said quickly, but her eyes kept darting toward where Bradford and his parents were engaged in conversation with her boss from Syntech. "It's just that this is a different kind of party, and I need everything to go perfectly." A different kind of party. Different from what, I wondered. Different from the birthday celebrations we'd shared when she was growing up, when success was measured by how much fun everyone had rather than how impressed the important people were. Different from the world where helping clean up was considered thoughtful rather than embarrassing. "Of course," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "I wouldn't want to interfere with your image." The word hit its mark, and I saw Jessica flinch, slightly as she realized I understood exactly what was happening. She wasn't ashamed of me personally. She was ashamed of what my behavior revealed about our shared background, our common history, the world we'd both come from before she'd learned to pretend she belonged somewhere else. I stayed for another hour, making polite conversation and smiling at appropriate moments while feeling increasingly like an actor who'd forgotten her lines. When I finally said my goodbyes and thanked Jessica for including me, her relief was so obvious that it was almost painful to witness. The elevator ride down to the parking garage gave me 60 floors to process what I'd experienced. 60 floors to understand that my daughter had become someone I barely recognized. Someone who valued approval from strangers more than loyalty to the person who'd made her success possible. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Phoenix, past the modest neighborhoods where people lived paycheck to paycheck and worked multiple jobs to give their children better opportunities, I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of my relationship with Jessica. She wasn't just growing distant, she was actively constructing a new identity that required my absence rather than my presence. The woman I'd raised would never have been embarrassed by someone helping to clean up after a party. The woman I'd raised understood that work was dignified regardless of whether it was performed by hired staff or family members. The woman I'd raised knew the difference between being successful and being superior, between earning respect and demanding deference. But that woman seemed to be disappearing, replaced by someone who'd learned to value appearance over authenticity and social status over personal integrity. The question was whether this transformation was permanent or whether some crisis might eventually force Jessica to confront the price she was paying for her acceptance into a world that would never truly accept her unless she continued to deny everything about where she'd actually come from. I parked in front of my small apartment building and sat in the car for a long time, listening to the engine cool and thinking about the 28 years I'd spent believing that love and sacrifice would be enough to ensure my daughter's happiness and success. Tonight had taught me that success without gratitude was just ambition in expensive clothes. and that a person could achieve everything they'd ever wanted while losing everything that actually mattered. The birthday party had been perfect in every way that Jessica valued, impressive and elegant, and calculated to enhance her standing with people whose approval she craved. But it had also been a performance rather than a celebration, a carefully orchestrated presentation designed to convince an audience rather than to share joy with people who actually cared about her. As I finally made my way up to my apartment, I wondered if Jessica even remembered what it felt like to be genuinely happy rather than strategically successful, to be loved for who she was rather than admired for who she appeared to be. The woman who'd raised her had tried to teach her that distinction, but apparently the lesson hadn't taken root deeply enough to survive the allure of a world where image was everything and authenticity was a luxury that only people without ambition could afford. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after Jessica's birthday party. I was preparing for another day of job interviews, trying to present myself as enthusiastic and qualified despite being out of work for nearly 5 months. The caller ID showed Dr. Webb's office, which confused me since I'd already collected my final paycheck and cleaned out my desk weeks earlier. It was Dr. Webb himself on the line, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic tension that immediately put me on alert. "Linda, I hope I'm not calling too early. I have some news that I thought you should hear directly from me rather than through the grapevine." My stomach dropped as I prepared for whatever blow was coming next. Perhaps there was an issue with my unemployment benefits, or problems with the references I'd been providing to potential employers. In my current financial situation, even small complications felt catastrophic. The dental group that bought my practice has decided to restructure more aggressively than they initially indicated, Dr. Webb continued. They're eliminating several positions, including yours, permanently. I wanted you to know that this decision has nothing to do with your performance, which was always exemplary. The words hit me like physical blows, each one eliminating another possibility for returning to the career I'd built over 25 years. "I understand," I managed, though I didn't really understand anything except that my professional future was disintegrating in real time. "There's more," Dr. Webb said gently. "They're also implementing a policy that prevents former employees from seeking positions with any of their affiliated practices. Linda, I'm afraid this effectively blocks you from most dental offices in the Phoenix metropolitan area." The room seemed to tilt around me as the implications sank in. Not only was my old job gone forever, but my entire career field was now largely inaccessible to me. At 52, I was facing the prospect of starting over in a completely different industry, competing with younger candidates who didn't carry the baggage of being overqualified or set in their ways. After Dr. Webb hung up, I sat at my small kitchen table staring at the stack of bills that had been accumulating faster than I could pay them. Rent, utilities, car insurance, student loan payments for an education that was apparently no longer valuable in the current job market. The numbers didn't add up to anything sustainable, and now they never would unless I could find work outside the only field I'd ever known. The unemployment benefits would run out in 3 months. My savings account had been empty for weeks. The credit cards I'd sworn never to use were already approaching their limits from emergency expenses like car repairs and medical bills. I was sliding toward a financial cliff with no safety net and no clear way to stop the descent. That afternoon, I called the one person who had both the means and, I believed, the moral obligation to help me through this crisis. Jessica answered, on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional as always during business hours. "Hi, Mom. I only have a few minutes between meetings. What's going on?" I explained about Dr. Webb's call, the industry blacklisting, the impossible job market for someone my age trying to change careers. My voice remained steady throughout the explanation, but I could feel cracks forming in my composure as the reality of my situation became clearer with each word I spoke. "That's really tough," Jessica said when I finished, her tone sympathetic but distant, as if she was discussing someone else's problems rather than her mother's crisis. Have you considered looking into retail? A lot of stores are hiring for customer service positions. Retail. Minimum wage work with no benefits and schedules that changed weekly. The kind of employment that might cover rent, but would never allow me to rebuild any kind of financial security. The suggestion revealed how completely Jessica misunderstood both the severity of my situation and the realities of the job market for older workers. "Jessica, I need help," I said directly, abandoning any attempt to maintain pride or dignity. "I need a place to stay while I figure out what comes next, just temporarily, until I can get back on my feet." The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to count my heartbeats, each one hammering against my ribs as I waited for my daughter to respond to the most vulnerable request I'd ever made. "Mom, you know I'd love to help, but my situation is really complicated right now," she finally said, her voice taking on the careful tone people use when they're about to deliver devastating news as gently as possible. "Complicated how?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I already knew the answer. "Bradford and I are talking about moving in together, and his parents are very involved in our relationship decisions. They have certain expectations about how things should look, especially since we're discussing engagement. How things should look." The phrase hit me like a slap, confirming what I'd suspected since the birthday party but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. I wasn't just being rejected because of financial inconvenience or space limitations. I was being rejected because my presence would complicate the image Jessica was working so hard to maintain. "I see," I said quietly. "And having your unemployed mother staying with you wouldn't fit with those expectations." "It's not about you personally," Jessica said quickly, but her words carried the hollow ring of someone trying to convince herself as much as me. "It's about timing and appearances, and the fact that Bradford's family has very traditional ideas about independence and success. Traditional ideas about independence and success. As if independence meant abandoning the people who'd sacrificed everything to give you the foundation for that success. As if success meant erasing any evidence of the struggle that had made it possible." "What about helping me financially?" I asked, hating myself for having to beg but seeing no alternative. "A loan to cover rent for a few months while I transition to a different career?" Another pause, and I could hear the sound of keyboard typing in the background, as if Jessica was multitasking through this conversation about her mother's potential homelessness. "Mom, I'm really not in a position to take on that kind of financial commitment," she said. "I have my own expenses, and Bradford and I are saving for our future together. Maybe you could apply for assistance programs? There are resources for people in your situation." People in my situation. As if I was a stranger seeking charity rather than the woman who'd worked 60-hour weeks and sold her jewelry so Jessica could attend private school and study abroad programs. As if my situation was something that had happened to me randomly, rather than something that was largely the result of the sacrifices I'd made for her benefit. "My situation," I repeated, my voice hardening despite my efforts to stay calm. "You mean the situation where I gave you everything I had and now have nothing left when I need help in return?" "That was your choice," Jessica said, her tone shifting to something colder and more defensive. "Nobody forced you to work those extra hours or pay for private school. You made those decisions because you wanted to, not because I asked you to." Those words landed like physical blows, each one designed to absolve her of any sense of obligation or gratitude. According to Jessica's logic, my sacrifices had been entirely selfish, motivated by my own desires rather than love for her. She was rewriting our entire history to eliminate any suggestion that she owed me anything in return for the foundation I'd provided for her success. "I made those choices because I loved you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted you to have opportunities I never had." "And I appreciate that," Jessica said, though her tone suggested that appreciation was a polite sentiment rather than a feeling that carried any moral weight. But you can't expect me to sacrifice my own future because you made choices that didn't work out financially. Choices that didn't work out financially. As if my current crisis was the result of poor planning rather than economic circumstances, beyond my control, combined with the natural consequences of having spent 28 years prioritizing her needs over my own financial security. "I'm not asking you to sacrifice your future," I said, desperation creeping into my voice despite my efforts to maintain dignity. "I'm asking you to help me temporarily while I rebuild mine." "Mom, I really can't," Jessica said with a finality that cut through any remaining hope I might have harbored. "I've worked too hard to build what I have to risk it now. Bradford's family has expectations, and I can't meet those expectations if I'm supporting unemployed relatives." Unemployed relatives. Not her mother, not the woman who'd raised her, but a generic category of people who represented potential embarrassment and financial drain. The clinical language was deliberate, designed to distance herself from both our relationship and any sense of obligation that relationship might entail. "I understand," I said, my voice hollow with the recognition that I was speaking to a stranger who happened to share my DNA. "I won't bother you again." "Mom, please don't be dramatic," Jessica said, but I could hear relief in her voice, the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully avoided an uncomfortable obligation. "This is just a temporary setback. You're strong, you'll figure it out." I hung up before she could offer any more empty encouragement or meaningless platitudes about my strength and resilience. Strength and resilience were luxuries for people who had safety nets and support systems. For people like me, they were simply the only alternatives to complete collapse. That night, I sat in my small apartment surrounded by the possessions I'd managed to save from my foreclosed house, taking inventory of both my material circumstances and the relationships that had defined my adult life. The financial situation was dire but manageable if I could find stable employment quickly. The emotional situation was something else entirely, a void where my most important relationship had been, replaced by the cold reality that love and sacrifice could be completely one-sided without the recipient feeling any corresponding obligation. I thought about the 28 years I'd spent believing that my relationship with Jessica was built on mutual love and respect, that the sacrifices I'd made would create a bond strong enough to survive temporary crises and difficult circumstances. Instead, I discovered that I'd been investing in someone who saw my contributions as freely given gifts, rather than deposits in an account that might someday provide support when I needed it. The transformation was complete now. Jessica's evolution from grateful daughter to self-made success story who owed nothing to anyone. She'd managed to convince herself that her achievements were entirely her own, that the foundation I'd provided was irrelevant to the structure she'd built on top of it. In her version of events, I was a supporting character in her story, rather than a central figure whose sacrifices had made her story possible. Over the following weeks, I applied for every job I could find, from administrative positions to retail work to restaurant service. The responses were universally polite and consistently negative, usually citing my overqualification or concerns about my long-term commitment to positions that were clearly beneath my education and experience level. It was during one of these fruitless job searches that I discovered the perfect opportunity for what was slowly forming in my mind as a plan for consequences rather than revenge. Phoenix Elite Catering was advertising for experienced event staff, specifically mentioning their specialization in high-end social functions for Scottsdale's most prominent families. The interview was straightforward, focused more on my availability and references than on my previous career in healthcare. The hiring manager appreciated my professional demeanor and customer service experience, noting that many of their clients specifically requested staff who could blend seamlessly into upscale environments without drawing attention to themselves. "We serve a very discerning clientele," she explained as she offered me a position. "People who expect perfection and invisibility in equal measure. Can you handle being in the background while others celebrate in the foreground?" I assured, That invisibility was one of my particular strengths, honed through years of working in other people's mouths, and more recently, through being systematically erased from my daughter's public narrative. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica's shame about my working-class background would now provide me with the perfect cover for observing her new world from the inside. My first event was a corporate function at one of Scottsdale's exclusive country clubs, serving cocktails to executives and their spouses while remaining completely unnoticed and unremarked upon. The work was physically demanding but emotionally satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. There was dignity in doing a job well, even if that job was invisible to the people who benefited from it. More importantly, the work gave me access to the social circles where Jessica was now trying to establish herself permanently. I learned the names of the families who mattered, the social hierarchies that governed their interactions, the unspoken rules that determined who belonged and who was merely tolerated. It was at one of these events that I first heard Jessica's name mentioned in conversation, not because anyone knew of our relationship, but because she was becoming a recognizable figure in their community. The conversation was between two women, discussing the upcoming social season and the various couples who would be participating in the traditional round of parties and fundraisers. "Bradford Wellington seems quite taken with that girl from the tech company," one of them said while I refilled their wine glasses with the practiced invisibility of professional service staff. "Jessica Martinez," the other woman replied. "Patricia. Wellington seems to approve, which is surprising given the girl's background." My hand stayed steady as I poured, though every instinct screamed at me to react to hearing my daughter discussed like a social experiment by people who had no idea of the sacrifices that had made her success possible. "What do you know about her background?" the first woman asked, with the casual curiosity of someone accustomed to investigating the credentials of anyone seeking entry into their exclusive world. "Nothing dramatic," her companion replied. "Middle-class family, public school until high school, state university. The kind of background that suggests ambition rather than breeding. But Patricia seems to think she can be molded appropriately." Molded appropriately. The phrase captured everything that was wrong with Jessica's approach to her new life. The assumption that she needed to be reshaped rather than appreciated for who she already was. More disturbing was the realization that Jessica was apparently willing to undergo that molding process, to allow herself to be transformed into someone who met their standards, rather than insisting that their standards accommodate her authentic self. I continued working these events throughout the spring, becoming increasingly familiar with the social landscape that Jessica was navigating and the expectations she was working so hard to meet. Each event provided new insights into the world she was desperate to join, and the price that world demanded for admission. The breaking point came in early June, when Phoenix Elite Catering was hired to staff the engagement party for Bradford Wellington III and Jessica Martinez, to be held at the Scottsdale Country Club with 150 of their closest friends and family members. When I saw the assignment on my schedule, I felt something click into place. A sense of destiny that was both thrilling and terrifying. This would be Jessica's moment of triumph, her official acceptance into the world she'd sacrificed everything to enter. It would also be my opportunity to remind her of the cost of that acceptance, and to demonstrate that the woman she'd discarded as an embarrassment had more power than she'd ever imagined. I accepted the assignment with the same professional demeanor I brought to all my work, giving no indication to my supervisor that this event held any personal significance for me. Just another night of serving champagne to wealthy people while remaining completely invisible and utterly forgettable. The weeks leading up to the engagement party were filled with preparation, both professional and personal. I researched the guest list, learning the names and backgrounds of everyone who would be in attendance. I studied the social dynamics of Jessica's new community, understanding the relationships and hierarchies that would determine how my eventual revelation would be received and interpreted. Most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for what I was about to do. This wasn't revenge in any traditional sense, but rather a reckoning. A moment when Jessica would be forced to confront the contradiction between her public narrative about family values and her private treatment of the family member who'd made her success possible. The night before the engagement party, I tried calling Jessica one more time, giving her a final opportunity to acknowledge our relationship and perhaps even invite me to attend as her mother rather than serve as invisible staff. The call went directly to voicemail, and I didn't leave a message. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with words alone. As I prepared for bed in my small apartment, surrounded by the modest possessions that represented my current circumstances, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since losing my job and my home. Tomorrow night, Jessica would learn that actions have consequences, even when those actions are taken against someone you've decided doesn't matter anymore. The woman who'd raised her had taught her many things about perseverance and determination, about working for what you wanted and never giving up on your dreams. Tomorrow night, she would learn the most important lesson of all, that you can't build lasting happiness on a foundation of shame about where you came from and the people who loved you enough to sacrifice everything for your success. Some debts come due whether you acknowledge them or not. Some truths demand to be heard, especially when they're being systematically denied by the people who benefit most from keeping them hidden. Tomorrow night, in front of everyone who mattered in Jessica's new world, the truth would finally have its moment to speak. The morning of Jessica's engagement party dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect Arizona day that made Scottsdale's reputation as a playground for the wealthy seem entirely justified. I woke early in my small apartment, feeling an unusual sense of calm that had been absent from my life for months. Today would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, though Jessica had no idea that her carefully orchestrated celebration was about to become something entirely different from what she'd planned. I prepared for the day with the same methodical attention to detail that had served me well throughout my career in healthcare. Professional black slacks, crisp white shirt, comfortable shoes that would allow me to work for hours without fatigue. My hair was pulled back in the same style I'd worn to countless catering events, and my makeup was minimal but polished. Just another member of the service staff, invisible and unremarkable to the guests who would be celebrating Jessica's official entry into Scottsdale's social elite. The drive to the country club took me through neighborhoods where I'd once imagined Jessica and I might visit together, where we'd walk through art galleries and share meals at restaurants that didn't require checking the prices before ordering. Those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else now, a naive woman who'd believed that love and sacrifice would be enough to maintain a relationship with someone determined to erase her past. Phoenix Elite Catering had assigned me to the cocktail service team, which meant I'd be circulating throughout the party with trays of champagne and appetizers, moving through the crowd with the practiced invisibility that made servers effectively part of the furniture. It was perfect positioning for what I had planned, close enough to observe and be seen when the moment was right, but unremarkable enough that no one would think twice about my presence until I chose to make myself known. The Scottsdale Country Club's ballroom had been transformed for the occasion, draped in cream and gold fabric that caught the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the golf course. Floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly rent adorned every table, and a string quartet played softly in one corner while guests began arriving in luxury vehicles that formed an impressive parade of wealth and status. I positioned myself near the service station where we collected fresh trays and disposed of empty ones, giving me a clear view of the main entrance where Jessica and Bradford were greeting their guests. She looked radiant in a champagne-colored dress that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothing in the past 3 years, her smile bright and confident as she accepted congratulations from people who represented her new life and future prospects. Bradford stood beside her with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world, shaking hands and making small talk with the fluency that came from a lifetime of attending exactly these kinds of events. His parents held court nearby, Patricia Wellington resplendent in designer silk, and Richard Wellington looking like he'd stepped out of a country club catalog from the 1950s. The guest list was exactly what I'd expected from my months of working. Similar events, a carefully curated collection of Scottsdale's most prominent families, mixed with Jessica's colleagues from Syntech and Bradford's business associates. These were people who moved in overlapping circles of wealth and influence, who attended each other's charity fundraisers and sat on the same nonprofit boards and sent their children to the same exclusive schools. I recognized several faces from previous catering jobs, people who'd looked through me without seeing me while I served their drinks and cleared their plates. The recognition was entirely one-sided, of course. To them, service staff were interchangeable and forgettable. Present when needed and invisible when not. It was exactly the kind of anonymity I needed for what I was planning. As the cocktail hour progressed, I moved through the crowd with professional efficiency, offering champagne and canapés while listening to conversations about real estate, investments and European vacations, charitable foundations and business mergers. These people spoke in the casual shorthand of shared privilege, making references to places and experiences that required significant wealth to access and understand. Jessica moved through these conversations with impressive skill, demonstrating that her integration into this world was nearly complete. She laughed at the right moments, made appropriate comments about topics ranging from art collections to polo matches, and displayed exactly the kind of cultural knowledge that suggested someone born to this lifestyle rather than someone who'd learned it through careful observation and imitation. It was during one of these conversations that I overheard the exchange that confirmed everything I'd suspected about Jessica's systematic erasure of her actual background. A woman I recognized as the wife of a prominent Phoenix attorney was asking Jessica about her family history, the kind of polite inquiry that served as social reconnaissance among people who needed to verify each other's credentials. "Your people are from Arizona originally?" the woman asked, while I refilled her champagne flute with the practiced invisibility of professional service. "Oh no," Jessica replied smoothly. "I'm actually from back east originally. My family has connections to the Connecticut area, though we've been in Arizona for several years now." Connecticut. The lie was so bold and complete that I nearly dropped the champagne bottle I was holding. Jessica had not only erased me from her narrative, she'd created an entirely fictional family background that positioned her as someone with East Coast establishment credentials rather than Southwest working-class roots. "How wonderful," the EB attorney's wife replied approvingly. "Connecticut has such lovely old families." "Which area specifically?" "The Westport region," Jessica said without hesitation, naming one of Connecticut's most exclusive communities. "My mother was involved in healthcare administration there before we relocated." Healthcare administration. At least that part contained a grain of truth. Though Jessica had transformed my career as a dental hygienist into something that sounded appropriately prestigious for her new social circle. I wondered what other creative revisions she'd made to our family history. What other inconvenient truths she'd polished into acceptable fiction. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Jessica fielding questions about her fictional Connecticut background, with the kind of detailed responses that suggested she'd been rehearsing this alternative history for months. She mentioned private schools I'd never heard of, and family connections to institutions that existed only in her imagination, constructing an elaborate mythology that positioned her as someone who belonged in Bradford's world by birth rather than ambition. I continued my circuit through the party, serving drinks and observing the social dynamics while feeling increasingly disconnected from the woman at the center of the celebration. This wasn't just social climbing or strategic image management anymore. Jessica had become someone entirely different, someone who could look important people in the eye and lie about the most fundamental aspects of her identity without showing any trace of guilt or discomfort. The moment I'd been waiting for came during the dinner portion of the evening, when Bradford stood to make a toast that would officially announce their engagement to the assembled guests. The string quartet stopped playing as he called for attention, and conversations gradually quieted as people turned toward the head table where he and Jessica sat with both sets of parents. Bradford's toast began with the expected themes of love and partnership, gratitude for family support, and excitement about their shared future. He spoke about Jessica's intelligence and ambition, her commitment to excellence, and her natural grace in social situations. Everything he said was technically true, but it was truth stripped of context, success presented as if it had emerged fully formed rather than being built through years of sacrifice and struggle. Most importantly, Bradford continued, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom's sound system, Jessica represents the kind of values that our families have always cherished. Integrity, loyalty to family, and a deep appreciation for the people who've shaped us into who we are today. The irony was so complete that I felt dizzy with the contradiction between his words and the reality of how Jessica had treated the person who'd actually shaped her into who she was. Integrity and loyalty to family were exactly the qualities she'd abandoned when she'd decided that acknowledging me would be inconvenient for her social advancement. I'm particularly impressed by Jessica's devotion to her family, Bradford added, looking lovingly at his fiancée while she beamed under the approval of people whose opinions would determine her future social status. She speaks so lovingly about her mother, who sacrificed everything to give Jessica the opportunities that brought her to this moment. Speaks so lovingly about her mother. I wondered what stories Jessica had told Bradford about our relationship, what fictional version of me she'd created to satisfy his family's expectations about proper maternal devotion. Certainly not the truth about refusing to help when I'd lost my job and my home, or about being too embarrassed by my working-class background to acknowledge our connection in public. In fact, Bradford continued, Jessica's mother couldn't be here tonight due to health issues, but I know she's watching from afar and feeling incredibly proud of the woman Jessica has become. Health issues. The latest revision to my story, positioning my absence as something noble and sympathetic rather than the result of being systematically excluded from Jessica's new life. I almost admired the creativity of it, the way she'd managed to explain my non-existence without admitting that she'd simply decided I was too embarrassing to acknowledge. The toast continued for another few minutes, with Bradford expressing gratitude to both families for their support and outlining his and Jessica's plans for a wedding that would bring together their two worlds in celebration of their shared values and bright future. Every word was calculated to reinforce the image they'd worked so hard to create, two people from appropriate backgrounds who'd found each other and would build something beautiful together. When Bradford finished speaking, the room erupted in applause and congratulations. Jessica stood to acknowledge the tribute, her face glowing with happiness and satisfaction as she accepted praise for achievements that were being attributed entirely to her own merit and Bradford's family's excellent judgment in welcoming her into their circle. It was then that I made my move, stepping forward from the service area where I'd been stationed and walking directly toward the head table with the confident stride of someone who belonged exactly where she was going. Several guests noticed the unusual sight of service staff approaching the honored couple during their moment of celebration, but most assumed I was delivering something or attending to some necessary detail of event management. I stopped directly, in front of the head table, close enough that Jessica couldn't possibly miss my presence, but far enough away that I wasn't violating any obvious boundaries of appropriate behavior. For several seconds, I simply stood there, waiting for her to notice me, and allowing the recognition to dawn slowly across her face. The color drained from Jessica's cheeks as she realized who was standing in front of her, wearing the uniform of invisible service staff at her engagement party. Her mouth opened slightly as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Bradford looked confused by her sudden change in demeanor, following her gaze to see what had captured her attention so completely. "Hello, Jessica," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the relative quiet that had settled over our immediate area. What a beautiful party, and such lovely words about family devotion and maternal sacrifice. The conversations at nearby tables began to quiet as people sensed that something unexpected was happening, though most still assumed this was some planned element of the evening's entertainment. Jessica remained frozen, her champagne glass halfway to her lips, and her face a mask of shock and growing horror. "I'm Linda Martinez," I continued, addressing the head table, but speaking loudly enough that surrounding guests could hear every word. "Jessica's mother, the one with the health issues who couldn't be here tonight." Bradford's confused expression shifted to something approaching alarm as he began to understand that this wasn't a planned interaction. Patricia Wellington's face showed the kind of sharp attention that wealthy women developed for detecting social threats, while Richard Wellington simply looked annoyed by the disruption to their carefully orchestrated celebration. "Mom," Jessica finally managed to whisper, the word barely audible but picked up by several people at nearby tables who were now watching with undisguised fascination. "I wanted to thank you for that beautiful toast about family values," I said, looking directly at Bradford while keeping my voice conversational and pleasant. "It's wonderful to hear how much Jessica appreciates the sacrifices her family made for her success." Bradford looked back and forth between Jessica and me, clearly trying to process the disconnect between the story he'd been told and the reality standing in front of him. "I don't understand," he said slowly. Jessica said, "You were in Connecticut, dealing with health issues." "Connecticut," I repeated with a slight smile. "How interesting. I've actually been right here in Phoenix the whole time, working as catering staff to pay rent after losing my job and my home." Which happened right around the time Jessica decided that having an unemployed mother might be bad for her image. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the sound of silverware clinking against plates as servers continued their work in other parts of the ballroom. Jessica sat motionless, her face cycling through expressions of shock, fear, and growing anger as she realized that her carefully constructed narrative was collapsing in real time. "Jessica," Patricia Wellington said in a voice that could have frozen champagne, "would you care to explain what's happening here?" But Jessica seemed incapable of explanation, paralyzed by the collision between her fictional background and the inconvenient reality of her actual mother standing in front of everyone who mattered in her new world. The woman who'd spent months perfecting her transformation into someone worthy of Bradford's family had apparently never prepared for the possibility that her discarded past might show up uninvited to her celebration. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," Bradford said, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that came from realizing a social disaster was unfolding in front of his parents and their most important friends. "Oh, there's definitely been a misunderstanding," I agreed pleasantly. "For instance, I understand that Jessica told you I was supportive of her relationship and proud of her success. But what she failed to mention is that when I lost my job and needed help, she told me that having me stay with her would be bad for her reputation. That's when I learned I was apparently too embarrassing to acknowledge." Bradford's face went pale as the implications of my words sank in. Around us, conversations had stopped completely as more guests turned their attention to the drama unfolding at the head table. I could see phones being discreetly pulled out, social media posts being composed in real time, as Phoenix's social elite documented the collapse of what should have been a perfect engagement celebration. "That's not what happened," Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out strained and defensive. "Mom, you're misunderstanding the situation." "Am I?" I asked, maintaining the same pleasant tone while feeling something fierce and liberating rising in my chest. "Then perhaps you could explain to Bradford and his family how you went from being Jessica Martinez from Tempe, whose mother worked as a dental hygienist, to being someone from Connecticut with connections to healthcare administration." The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Jessica to choose between continuing her elaborate fiction and acknowledging the truth about her background and our relationship. I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes as she weighed the social costs of each possible response. "Mom, please," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality that was entirely different from the confident tone she'd used throughout the evening. "Can we discuss this privately?" "Privately," I repeated. "Like when I called you for help?" And you told me that your colleagues couldn't know you were letting a failure stay with you? That kind of private discussion? Patricia Wellington's expression had shifted from confusion to the kind of cold fury that wealthy people reserved for discovering they'd been deceived about something important. "Jessica," she said in a voice that could have cut glass, "I think you need to explain exactly what's going on here." But Jessica seemed to have run out of explanations that could reconcile her fictional narrative with the reality standing in front of her. The woman who'd spent months perfecting her integration into Scottsdale's social elite was discovering that some truths were too large and persistent to be erased by wishful thinking and strategic omission. "The truth is quite simple," I said, addressing the entire head table while feeling a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing from my life for months. "Jessica is my daughter, and I've spent 28 years working multiple jobs and making sacrifices so she could have opportunities I never had. When I lost my job and needed help, she decided that acknowledging me would be inconvenient for her social advancement." I paused, looking directly at Jessica while she sat frozen, between her fictional identity and her actual history. But apparently, family values and maternal sacrifice make excellent talking points for engagement toasts, as long as the actual family members stay invisible. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of chairs scraping against the each-eyed floor as guests at nearby tables leaned closer to hear every word of the confrontation. I could see the social media activity intensifying, phones capturing video and photos that would ensure this moment lived forever in Phoenix's collective memory. Bradford looked like someone who'd discovered that everything he thought he knew about reality had been an elaborate illusion. "Jessica?" he said slowly. "Is this true?" Jessica's composure finally cracked completely, tears starting to flow as she realized that there was no way to explain away the contradiction between her words about family devotion and her actions toward the family member who'd made her success possible. "It's complicated," she managed between sobs. But the explanation satisfied no one, least of all Bradford's parents, who were watching their carefully vetted future daughter-in-law dissolve into someone they didn't recognize. "What's complicated about it?" Patricia Wellington asked with the kind of precision that suggested years of practice in identifying and eliminating social threats. "Either you told us the truth about your background, or you didn't." I felt a moment of something that might have been pity for Jessica, watching her realize that the world she'd worked so hard to enter was about to reject her for the same reasons she'd rejected me. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by the satisfaction of watching someone learn that consequences were real and unavoidable, even for people who thought they'd successfully escaped their past. "I should let you get back to your celebration," I said, stepping away from the head table with the same professional demeanor I'd maintained throughout my months of catering work. "I have tables to serve, and you have explanations to make." I turned and walked back toward the service area, leaving Jessica to face the wreckage of her carefully constructed new identity, while surrounded by people who'd just learned that everything they thought they knew about her was a lie. Behind me, I could hear urgent whispered conversations starting up as guests began to process what they'd witnessed and discuss the implications for Jessica's future in their social circle. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of professional service and personal satisfaction. I continued serving drinks and clearing plates while watching Jessica attempt to manage the social crisis that had erupted around her engagement celebration. The party continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Conversations now focused on the drama they'd witnessed rather than celebration of the happy couple. Bradford spent most of the remaining evening in intense conversation with his parents, their expressions growing more serious as they discussed the implications of Jessica's deception for their family's reputation and social standing. Jessica sat largely alone at the head table, occasionally approached by guests who seemed more interested in gathering gossip than offering support. By the time the evening ended, it was clear that Jessica's engagement party had become something entirely different from what she'd planned. Instead of cementing her place in Scottsdale's social elite, it had exposed the lies and omissions that had made that acceptance possible. The woman who'd worked so hard to erase her past had learned that some truths were too powerful to stay buried forever. I collected my things from the staff area and left through the service entrance, walking out into the desert night with my shoulders straight and my conscience clear. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again, not the invisible woman. Jessica had tried to erase from her life, but Linda Martinez, who'd raised a daughter and deserved better than being treated like a shameful secret. The next morning brought phone calls and text messages that I didn't answer, desperate attempts from Jessica to explain or apologize or somehow repair the damage that had been done. But some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt with words, alone, and some lessons could only be learned through consequences rather than conversations. Within a week, news reached me through Sophie that Jessica's engagement had been called off, that Bradford's family had decided she wasn't suitable for their son after all. The woman who'd sacrificed everything for social acceptance had discovered that acceptance based on lies was temporary and fragile, subject to immediate revocation when the truth inevitably surfaced. I felt no satisfaction in Jessica's loss, only a quiet recognition that justice had been served and truth had prevailed over fiction. Some people might say I went too far, that family should forgive family regardless of the circumstances. But I'd learned something important that night at the country club. You can't love someone into loving you back, and you can't sacrifice your way into someone's respect. The woman who'd raised Jessica had taught her many things about perseverance and determination, about working for what you wanted and never giving up on your dreams. But apparently, I'd failed to teach her the most important lesson of all, that you can't build lasting happiness on a foundation of shame about where you came from and the people who loved you enough to sacrifice everything for your success. 6 months later, I was working steady hours at Dr. Patricia Hernandez's dental practice, having finally found an employer who valued experience and loyalty over youth and novelty. My small apartment had become home rather than just temporary shelter, and I'd rebuilt a life that was modest but dignified, based on honest work rather than borrowed status. Jessica and I had no contact during those months, the silence between us growing more permanent with each passing day. Sophie served as an occasional messenger, reporting that Jessica had moved to a smaller apartment and was working longer hours to rebuild her professional reputation after the engagement scandal. She'd apparently learned that reinventing yourself was easier than maintaining an invented identity, especially when that identity required constantly denying your actual history. I thought about reaching out sometimes, wondered if enough time had passed for Jessica to understand what she'd lost when she'd chosen status over family. But then I'd remember the look on her face when she'd told me I was too embarrassing to acknowledge, the casual cruelty of someone who saw other people as obstacles to overcome rather than relationships to nurture. Some debts can never be repaid, and some betrayals can never be forgiven. That night at the country club, Jessica had learned that the woman she'd discarded as an embarrassment had more strength and dignity than she'd ever imagined. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the lesson that actions have consequences, even when those actions are taken against the person who loved them first and most completely. I sleep peacefully now, knowing that I'd stood up for myself when it mattered most, that I'd refused to remain invisible when visibility was what justice required. Jessica had wanted a mother she could be proud of in public while treating her like an embarrassment in private. Instead, she'd learned that the woman who'd raised her had been watching, listening, and remembering everything. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how deeply you try to bury it. And sometimes, when the truth finally emerges, it carries with it all the power of years of denial and suppression, transforming a quiet revelation into a devastating reckoning that changes everything in an instant. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.